thank you so much for joining us on Weekend Dawn. Really appreciate it. Now, what are your overall thoughts of the phased lockdown stages and us moving into the next phase after a month of total lockdown?
I think it's a really good move. We've got to be quite careful about the immediate withdrawal of the lockdown. So there is a need to prepare the groundwork for moving back toward a modicum of normality. But part of what needs to be developed during this phase, certainly this next week, are the health protocols that the businesses that would open need to comply with. We also need to deal with the health protocols for any kind of bulk transport and any instance where people will need to gather for the purposes of going to work for those businesses that would be reopened. But essentially, we need to get back to the point where people are working again and earning incomes and selling things.
Prof, do you think the timing is right, considering that South Africa hasn't exactly reached its peak of this coronavirus spread?
Well, we've already been engaging in strategies to suppress the epidemic, so there isn't a peak as such unless the lockdown doesn't work. Now, we do know that it's not working in a number of areas and that people aren't able to social distance in some environments, and those areas may in fact still experience the epidemic. But if you're actively engaged in suppressing the epidemic, we're not going to see a peak. We're going to see either a horizontal movement or a decline. Now, we haven't seen the decline, and we have seen a rise in the last few days, sort of certainly the last week. And that is a worrying trend. It depends what we're seeing there. But I think this idea that we're kind of rising to some sort of peak and then coming down is incorrect if you're directly intervening to suppress the epidemic.
Now, what happens if the phasing doesn't work? Do you think there's another chance of another lockdown? Will we move back to phase 5?
I think that would not be a wise strategy to go into. I think that we would go into an approach in which we would have more localized lockdowns where required. So where you identify a particular outbreak cluster, you would rather lock down that area, go in, test, quarantine, and then withdraw. But I think that the idea that we just generally lock down the economy is a bad idea going forward. But the idea that we have to potentially target specific areas for a greater emphasis on suppression of the epidemic is the way to go. But it's not entirely clear that we're ready to actually implement such a strategy yet, because the testing program, it does not appear to be at a satisfactory level. And we don't have an idea as to how the contact tracing is working. But that is our strategy. That has to be, that will be the key pillar of our strategy going forward in tandem with the phasing out of the lockdown.
Let's talk economy now. When you think about this 500 billion rand that's going to be injected to resuming the economic activity of the economy, do you really think it is going to help help the economy sort of resurface and recover?
Well, one of the problems that we have is that it's quite difficult for government programs to properly reach the vulnerable in South Africa. We can get to people who are part of an existing system, but South Africa has never implemented a complete social protection, social security system. So whereas if you see in other countries, you're able to immediately get to the vulnerable people, the people who are losing their jobs, or to go to the firms to prevent people from losing their jobs. And you can see the difference between the United States, for instance, which will just have a huge number of unemployed people, and Europe, where they're actually able to protect people in employment. In future, we are going to have to fix that gap, but we have that now. But the 500 billion goes some way. They may struggle to spend some of it because of the absence of systems, but we will wait and see.
Professor, how long do you think South Africa will remain in this phase 4 stage? Do you have any indication on what it will take for us to get to phase 3 or stage 3?
I think that a lot is, on the one hand, they've got triggers that are related to how the epidemic is doing, whether or not it's the so-called reproduction rate of the disease comes down. I think that a large part of the movement forward is going to be principally on whether or not you can define very, very strong health protocols for businesses. So certainly the first stage, they would probably want to get major parts of the economy going again, but you've got to get the small businesses going, and you want to see whether or not there are opportunities to get education going again. But I think that they would go in a cautious manner, trying to get more and more protocols in place so that more and more businesses can open. So I think that's actually going to be the biggest driver of a movement into the various stages, because you can protect the population more through those protocols and a continuation of social distancing. And so, for instance, things like working from home are going to be important things in all stages going forward, and wearing masks outside. And if those things work together with the testing and contact tracing, you can move progressively to lower and lower stages.
And what is your overall opinion on how government has handled the entire situation, considering that rural areas and places that didn't have the likes of running water, etc., have now been brought to the attention of government? Do you think they've done enough in terms of helping out the people with poor sanitation, etc.?
Well, I think the lockdown was introduced without a real clear plan, and I think that's a concern. So there wasn't much time for people to think it through. But the question really is whether the lockdown itself has bought time for people to do the kind of work that's required to have a much more carefully thought through strategy as we progress through the year. Because we actually now need a proactive strategy, not one where you're on the back foot perpetually, which certainly has been my perception of the approach thus far. There hasn't been clear thought. We introduced the lockdown without having any plan for the vulnerable. It was going to be sort of worked out as we go along. And that's not really the way to do things. Now, the question is really, have we moved fast enough for those groups? And perhaps there's a number of important social lessons that we've learned about the permanent state of vulnerability of such a large part of the population, and that has to be addressed going forward. It's not just this epidemic we're going to be fighting in future. We have to look at the overall social status of the country, and this epidemic is merely showing all the cracks in our system.
Social lessons learned. Thank you so much. That was Chair of Social Security at the Wits University School of Governance, Professor Alex van Den Heever.